Hello and welcome to PocketGamer.biz's weekly news digest. This is for the week ending the 7th of November 2014. Hi, I'm Jon Jordan. So this week, as a bit of last week, we're kind of in the financial kind of a reporting period. So that means all the companies who have their shares on various stock exchanges around the world are reporting their kind of quarterly, normally their Q3, depending on how they kind of arrange their quarters, but basically it's for the 3 months ending 30th of September, so September, August and July sales. Obviously these tend to be the bigger companies, but it's kind of interesting every kind of 3 months we get to see kind of a snapshot of how different companies are kind of operating, if they're going up or down, and equally kind of how different kind of markets, particularly global markets, are kind of developing. It's been kind of particularly interesting this week where there's two companies, two Korean based games publishers, Com2uS and Gamevil. So for a long time they were kind of arch rivals. They were the kind of the mid-sized pure mobile developers or publishers in that country, making free-to-play games, having quite strong kind of revenue from Korea, and then over the last kind of couple of 3 or 4 years they've been developing internationally, particularly in the US. But what's kind of interesting, so we've kind of on PocketGamer.biz we've been tracking them for a number of years and kind of comparing them because they're kind of similar companies doing similar things. And Com2uS used to be the bigger one, and then kind of Gamevil kind of like was a scrappy underdog and fought its way back to become bigger, and then kind of Gamevil kind of accelerated away again. But now that's kind of slightly less of the undercurrent now, because Gamevil actually owns a majority stake in Com2uS. So that happened kind of last year. So they're kind of like their rival. They're kind of, well, they're not really rivals now, but they're kind of like two parts of the same company in a way. But they're still kind of interesting to compare them. So, but both of them put their quarterly figures out this month, and both of them actually their quarterly figures are kind of amazing, really. So Com2uS is the bigger of the two by revenue. So it's have a quick look at my cheat sheet. So its revenue was up 102%. That's quarter on quarter for Q3. So it's basically doubled compared to Q2. So that's obviously pretty impressive. And that was its kind of revenue figures are, it's $85 million, which is a fairly large amount of money. And most interesting, I guess, you kind of get to see, particularly in what we are now in the free to play market. Its profit was 40 million, almost $40 million. So effectively, its margin was profit to sales was 50%, which is pretty incredible. So and it's kind of come off two games that are not necessarily, that well known. So there's Ace Fishing, which is a fishing game, and Summoner's War, which has been downloaded over 20 million times, but it's still a fairly what we call kind of mid-core, hardcore kind of RPG. So it's kind of interesting that those games have kind of propelled the company to that status, and fairly kind of quickly in that quarter. So you can see it's doubled from the last quarter. So we kind of see in the free-to-play industry that when you have a hit, you get hit very quickly and very big. Things can change quite quickly. I guess we saw that with Glue last week. So the other company is Gamevil. It's a kind of smaller company, but the big thing for it is its sales for 2014, which is actually calendar year 2014, will for the first time be over $100 million, which for it is obviously kind of a great thing. Well, you can tell the comparison that Gamevil's sales for 2014 as a whole will be $100 million, whereas Com2uS for a quarter was 85. So obviously, kind of Com2uS is by far the bigger company. But with Gamevil, so its sales, having a quick check on my cheat sheet again, so its sales are up 28% quarter on quarter. And what's interesting in both of those with both those companies, while the Korean market is very strong and lucrative, where they're basically seeing very strong growth is outside of Korea, and particularly for Com2uS, which kind of really broke down its figures. It's seeing really big sales in what they call Asia Pacific outside Korea. So they're seeing that Japan, China, Hong Kong and Taiwan are the big markets for that. But even that's about 50% of its market now is in Asia, if you include Korea as well. But the kind of interesting thing was actually Europe, although kind of much smaller in terms of absolute size, Europe grew year on year. I think it was something like 1,600%. So kind of Europe was growing as fast as Asia Pacific for Com2uS, partly because it didn't have such a big kind of sales in that market before. But it's kind of interesting. So often in the West we look at kind of China, I guess in particular, but we look at Asia Pacific as being the big growth area. But for companies like Com2uS who are in Asia Pacific, actually Europe and the US can still be a very strong growth market for them, as big as China would be potentially for Western companies. So to kind of get a different perspective. So I guess the other big company that was interesting to look at this quarter was King. So obviously King has floated floated this year, didn't it? So it's not done that many quarters of revenue, but it's kind of in some ways you can kind of see its IPO was very cleverly done. It clearly floated at the right time. So obviously for companies, you want to float just while your profits are kind of still exploding, because investors obviously want to see that you're very profitable and your profits are increasing, and they want to then buy shares in the company with not necessarily the assumption, but there is I guess an underlying assumption that growth is going to continue. Obviously King's growth was, as we've spoken about, kind of how the free-to-play market works. King's kind of growth in its IPO was predicated on the massive success of Candy Crush Saga. It's one of the kind of few games that's $1 billion game, a kind of a franchise. The kind of second one after Gung-Ho's Puzzle and Dragons. And that kind of really, the company's all been very profitable, but kind of the global success of Candy Crush Saga kind of completely changed kind of King as a company that was just generating vast amounts of profit. I guess unfortunately you can kind of suggest that maybe in the long term it's not good to IPO when you're just the next quarter after your IPO quarter is going to be a weaker quarter because you're basically you peaked before the IPO, if you see what I mean. And that's kind of what's happened with King. So it's kind of one of these relative things now where people go, oh, King, they're a declining company, and if I check my cheat sheet, so the quarterly sales were down 13%, which is, investors don't like to see that, but if that kind of like hides, I guess, some absolute figures. The kind of revenue was over revenue was $514 million in the quarter, which is just enormous. Clearly, compared to those Korean companies we're talking about, it's 5-6 times bigger. So King is still a massive company, and the interesting thing is when you look at these companies, is how they're generating cash. So during the quarter, King generated over $140 million of cash, and its cash pile is now just under $1 billion. So it's one of these companies where you look at the share price from the IPO, it's not been successful at all. If you bought shares in companies, if you bought shares in games companies, you should have your head examined. People, certainly individuals, shouldn't be doing that, and it's very tricky to buy shares in games companies and make money, from my personal view. What's interesting for King is it's still generating vast amounts of kind of revenue per quarter, and actually, last quarter it said it was going to give a dividend out to people who bought the shares, which is kind of a standard way of kind of if the share price isn't going up, then you can give money back to the shareholders by dividend. It's not technically, tech companies tend not to do that, so it took Apple a long time to start giving dividends back to its shareholders, even though it has $100 billion in cash. So it's not something that people tend to like to do. I think it's something that someone like a company like King probably should be doing more of, because its kind of growth phase is over. Although it was trying to pretend it, well, not pretend, that's a dangerous word, isn't it? It was pointing out that if you strip out Candy Crush Saga, which is by far its largest game, it still has $1 billion of revenue from games that aren't Candy Crush Saga. So it kind of came up with this phrase, it's non-Candy Crush Saga business, which is kind of it could be a clever way of doing it, a clever way of kind of like trying to kind of tell people that its big hit isn't necessarily as important to the company as they think it is, but potentially that could be a weakness as well, because it has a massive hit in Candy Crush Saga, which it's going to do more games on. It's got a new game coming out based on the Candy Crush Saga this month. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. That's kind of like what's going on with some of the big companies. And just another company that it's not a publicly owned company, so it doesn't put out its kind of share price, or it doesn't put out its financials, but not that one owned still in the mobile space, pretty big in Facebook and browser stuff, but it's a company from Germany called Good Games Studios, which kind of has come to prominence. It's doing a lot more mobile stuff now, and it kind of came to prominence a couple of weeks ago. It had a press release that announced it had hired its 1,000th employee. So it now claims that it's the biggest games developer in Germany. 1,000 employees is clearly a lot. And it just won a Deloitte's award for its growth over the last 5 years. Was its growth? They didn't say what its sales are, but over 5 years, its growth has been 28,000%, which is pretty impressive. So maybe at some point we'll see Good Games IPOing as well. And we'll look at their kind of quarters. But that was lots of numbers this week. Maybe we'll get a bit more kind of personal news next week. But see you then.